All right, last part. Let's go ahead and do it for the possibly one of you that's actually using these. But World War One. Oh, sorry. We're matching presidents with events. World War One, said it a bunch of times. World War One, Woodrow Wilson, right? That W alliteration on there. World War One, Woodrow Wilson. Okay. World War II, our longest serving president in US history, the only one to be elected 4 times to office, died very early into that fourth term. Um, Franklin D. Roosevelt, which also makes it where technically you can put down Harry S. Truman, because Harry Truman does finish out the war, right? Building of the Panama Canal. This is one of our big imperialist projects, right? We convinced Panama to even have a revolution against Colombia so we can build that canal. This is not the president that it's finished under because it takes so long to build the Panama Canal, but the one mostly associated with it is Theodore Roosevelt. Good old TR pushes for the building of that Panama Canal. We can connect our Navy side to side, east to west coast very easily. And it is a massive point of trade, right? Cements the US as a world power. French tried to do it. They couldn't cut it. We did. Stock market crash. Now, we think of the stock market crash as being associated with the Great Depression. The first president you should think of for the Great Depression is probably FDR. Technically, though, remember, the Great Depression doesn't begin with FDR. FDR gets elected partially because of how poorly this president handles the stock market crash and the bank runs and the onset of the Great Depression. This guy doesn't really do anything. That's why they start naming homeless encampments after him, like Hoovervilles, which makes it Herbert Hoover is the president when the stock market crash happens. Now, Vietnam War is a couple of different presidents can go under that one, right? But they do make it more specific with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Remember, this is the resolution that we lied to be able to get this resolution passed. It gave full military power to the president, essentially. And it is Lyndon B. Johnson that lies about that ship getting attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin to get the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed. Now, the war does not end under Johnson. Johnson decides not to run for president again. One of the big reasons is how unpopular the Vietnam War is under him. He talks about how one of his strongest memories of being president, one of the things that made him not want to be president anymore, is every day he could hear chanting outside of the White House because of the anti-war protests, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Right. To give you an idea of how big the anti-war protests were getting and how much that started to affect him. So that Lyndon B. Johnson was at the beginning. Nixon gets elected, running on ending the Vietnam War. It does still take him quite a while to get it ended, but the war does end under Nixon. And remember who wins that war? Not us, the North Vietnamese, right? We have the fall of Saigon in 1975, shortly after US forces leave, where the Vietnamese definitively, or North Vietnamese definitively end up winning that war. Bombing of Pearl Harbor. This is what gets us into World War I. One of the only dates that I keep saying, you have to know the exact date. December 7th, 1941. If it is what gets us involved in World War I, it's going to be the president, or sorry, World War II, it's going to be the president at the beginning of World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? Dropping of the atomic bombs. Now, this ends World War II, at least the fighting against the Japanese in World War II. We'd already had VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. This is VP Day, Victory in the Pacific, happens after this, right? That is Harry S. Truman makes the decision to drop the atomic bombs. Bombing of Cambodia and Laos. This is an escalation of the Vietnam War that happens. It is made, the decision to do this is made by the president solely because of that Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Right now, that might make you think, oh, it's Johnson. But remember, that resolution doesn't go away for a while. This actually happens under Nixon, even though he said he was going to de-escalate the war. This is one of the big things that becomes a controversy with the releasing of the Pentagon Papers, something that kind of showed how the United States government was lying about our efforts in Vietnam, everything that was going on, kind of. And it shows that we had made the decision to escalate the war, even though Nixon said we were getting out. This is under Nixon that we have the bombing of Cambodia and Laos. The Tet Offensive, that one's a hard one to remember specifically which presidents it's under. They're probably not going to ask you a question about which president. Honestly, if you think LBJ or Nixon on that one, sorry. If you think LBJ or Nixon on that one, that's fine. Technically, it's Nixon. Just not technically. I mean, it is Nixon. But if you think either of them, that's fine. Sorry. Internment of Japanese Americans. This happens in World War II, right? Because of Pearl Harbor and the distrust of Japanese Americans. This happens early in the war. That is going to be under FDR. Right. Launching of Sputnik. Now, this one's a tough one, possibly, to know exactly, exactly which president it's under. It's in 1957. So it's close to being Kennedy, who we think of as the space race president a lot of times. But it's actually just before Kennedy gets in office. This happens under Eisenhower. This one, again, not necessarily the most important to know which president it happens under. As long as you think like 1950s, 1960s, know that it causes the space race, those kinds of things, you're fine on the launching of Sputnik. Dust Bowl. Now, again, this one's technically more than one president. It starts early in the Great Depression. It's near the beginning of the Great Depression in 1930 when the Dust Bowl happens. So this is still under Hoover that it begins. However, it goes through to 1936. So it is also under FDR. So Dust Bowl, another one that can be multiple. D-Day invasion. The D-Day invasion happens in World War II. This is in late World War II, but FDR is still alive. FDR is still alive during the D-Day invasion in 1944. It's actually a couple months after, I believe, only a couple months after the D-Day invasion that he dies. That FDR dies on that one. Ending of the Korean War. This is another war that this president campaigned on ending, that once he was elected, he would be able to end the Korean War. This is under Eisenhower that we get the end of the Korean War. Eisenhower, like I said, campaigns on ending it, and he actually does fairly quickly. In 1953 is when Eisenhower ends the Korean War. Watergate scandal. This one should be easy. You should know who the president during the Watergate scandal was. Richard Nixon, right? War on Poverty. This is a program of one of the presidents. It is a part of the Great Society, that expansion of the welfare state, creating Medicare and Medicaid, expanding food stamps, workers' disability and unemployment rights, all of those things, right? This is LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, that had the War on Poverty, right? Founding of the National Park Service. This one, again, is kind of two presidents. The one that's more closely associated with it that you do need to know is Teddy Roosevelt. If you think about kind of the image of Teddy Roosevelt, is this like outdoorsman, tough guy that, you know, he starts the bull moose party, so strong, he gets shot in the chest and keeps his speech going, right? Those are all he's the imperialist going out with his big stick and taking over these other countries and making sure nobody else messes with us. So you can think of Theodore Roosevelt. It officially does happen under Woodrow Wilson, though. So Spanish-American War. This one you might think, honestly, and I would also in my head just hearing Spanish-American War, the first person I think of is Theodore Roosevelt. However, it is a president we talk about a little bit less. It is President McKinley that this one actually happens under. Not super common that they're going to ask you the president under. Honestly, I would just keep the idea of imperialism with it and kind of associate Teddy Roosevelt with imperialism, but this does happen under McKinley, is the Spanish-American War. Cuban Missile Crisis. This is like the peak of the Cold War, right? This is the closest we ever get to a full-on nuclear war with the Soviets, is the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that happens under President Kennedy, right? JFK is the president during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Remember, Russia wants to put nuclear missiles on Cuba to kind of counteract the ones that we have in Turkey and in other places in Europe. Kennedy negotiates with the Soviet president, or Soviet premier, but you can think of him as a president. And they decide both of them will remove the nukes from Turkey and from Cuba. And that kind of resolves the crisis. The Persian Gulf War. This is basically the last war that the United States won very definitively and very quickly. It's over in 30 days, right? It happens because of Iraq's invasion into Kuwait for those oil resources. And this war is under Bush Sr., H.W. Bush. This is under Bush Sr. that the Persian Gulf War happens. So let's go over. Scroll up a little bit. Annexation of the Philippines. Now, again, this happens directly as a result of what war? What war do we start becoming more and more imperialist because of? That is the Spanish-American War. McKinley is still president when we annex the Philippines. So that is going to be under McKinley. VJ Day and VE Day, Victory over Japan Day and Victory over Europe Day. FDR dies before we end up winning in either theater of the war, right? You should know for sure VJ Day is under Truman, right? Because the dropping of the nuclear bombs is signed off on by Truman. That happens under Truman's administration. You know, we don't win the war before we drop those bombs, right? Be pretty horrible. Well, there's arguments that dropping the bombs are horrible anyways, but definitely be a lot worse if we dropped them after we won. So desegregation of the military. Desegregation of the military happens in 1948. That's why our first integrated military fights in the Korean War. This desegregation of the military happens under Truman. Truman desegregates the military, just like he desegregated his inauguration, if you remember when we read about that way back on our book assignment. But the desegregation of the military is under Truman. 14 points. This was the plan for peace after World War I. Who was president during World War I, looking over at the beginning over there, Woodrow Wilson, right? Woodrow Wilson writes the 14 points. He wants us to enter the League of Nations. He wants to have international waters, have a lot more peace restrictions on them, bunch of things to prevent another world war. The League of Nations fails, like we know, because the United States doesn't join, because we're isolationist, right? We don't want to interact in foreign affairs as well. We don't want to interact in European conflicts. We're still definitely very interventionist in South America, as we've talked about with like annexation of the Philippines, our growing imperialism, and all of those kinds of things. But we don't want to have to deal with the big boys in Europe and all of those global conflicts that could happen as a result. War Powers Act. The War Powers Act takes the military powers, the full military powers given to the president by the Gulf of Tonkin resolution away. War Powers resolution takes away the military powers given by the Gulf of Tonkin. That happens under Nixon. They get taken away after we kind of get like the Pentagon Papers find out about all of this rampant military action and escalation that happened under both Johnson and Nixon, and people want to take those powers away from the president, right? And because it disbalanced our government, the declaration of war was always supposed to be under Congress, and this basically took that power away from Congress, messing with the scales that were supposed to be put in place by those checks and balances, right? Executive Order 9066. This is a tough one every time it comes up because we forget it because it just says Executive Order 9066. But what did Executive 9066 put in place? The Executive Order 9066 put in place, I'm looking for it over here, the internment camps for Japanese Americans. Remember, that was that. I told you to draw an arrow before between the Executive Order 9066 and the internment camps way back on day one when they were both in the same section. I would do it again over here just as another reminder. Those are the same thing, right? If they're the same thing, again, that's going to have happened under FDR. Berlin airlift, this happens kind of right after World War II. Who is the president at the end of World War II? Harry Truman deals with the first major conflict in the Cold War, the Berlin airlift. Civil Rights Act of 1964, this just barely, again, is a new president. The president that it would have happened under was assassinated in Dallas just a little bit before the Civil Rights Act was to be passed. It actually kind of put the Civil Rights Act in jeopardy of getting passed a little bit. But LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy's vice president that became president after he was assassinated, does sign this act into law. Okay, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Remember, that's the one that bans segregation basically in any modern business, because it's any business that does interstate trade or has a contract with the federal government. Very, very difficult to have a business that does not do some form of interstate trade in the modern era. Camp David Accords, we talked a little bit about this. They were a very big peace treaty signed between Israel and Egypt that ended a 30-year-long war between Egypt and Israel because of some land disputes that were going on, right? And this was an accomplishment of Jimmy Carter, right? Jimmy Carter, much more successful with international policies, kind of much more well-known for his international policies than he necessarily is for domestic policy. Going down, the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. We talked about this one on day two. The FDIC, right? That goes under the New Deal programs. Well, if I'm telling you it's the New Deal, you should know which president was the New Deal president. FDR, right? He gets these passed to kind of prevent those bank runs that were throwing us directly into the Great Depression, right? That's what makes the Depression so much worse, is all of those bank failures, everybody losing their life savings, all that stuff, right? That along with the bank holiday where he shuts down all banks throughout the country for about a week to make sure only the strong banks are still left open. I'm going to pause. I really need to blow my nose. Sorry. Okay, sorry, I really need to blow my nose. FDIC talked about that. Teapot Dome scandal. Haven't talked about this in a minute. This is an older one. Huge, huge scandal that happens under a president we actually don't talk much about. One of the only presidents to die of natural causes while they're president, Warren G. Harding. Remember, it was not actually directly tied to Harding. It does happen under his administration. We'll talk more about it later, so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail because we do have presidential scandals somewhere in here. Oh, it's the next section. Presidential scandals. We'll talk about the Teapot Dome scandal a little bit more. So I'll just hold off for now. Pardoning of Richard Nixon. Remember, Nixon has to step down because of what scandal? The Watergate scandal. He steps down because he knows he's probably going to get impeached because of it, because of those tapes that were that had the recordings of him basically committing crimes, or at least covering up a crime, which in itself is a crime that we'll talk about down there. But so his vice president, the only president to never be elected to office at all, right? well, elected to presidential office, neither as vice president or president, right? Because he gets appointed by Nixon, actually, because Spiro Agnew, his first vice president, had to step down because he also had corruption issues going on that broke from when he was governor. But anyways, the only president to never be elected to office, Gerald Ford, President Gerald Ford, is not elected ever, and pardons Nixon as one of his first actions as president. Very unpopular. People see it as, this more and more corruption going on, right? It opens up even wider that credibility gap we've talked about a couple of times, where people start distrusting the government more and more, right? Iran-Contra affair, another scandal we'll talk about in just a second. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail. But if we remember, the Iran-Contra affair happened under Ronald Reagan. He's dubbed the Teflon president, basically because it doesn't really affect him, even though it's very directly tied to his administration. And it's a pretty big scandal when it comes out. There's a lot of congressional hearings. People get charged with crimes. A lot of people go to jail as a result of it. But Reagan remains very popular after this. And the Iran-Contra affair, that is Ronald Reagan. Iran hostage crisis actually kind of helped get Reagan elected. It didn't happen under his administration, it happened right before his administration, but the president that was in office during this crisis was having a hard time getting this crisis solved. Remember, over 50 American embassy workers are taken hostage. They're there for over 400 days, while Jimmy Carter is basically shown as being powerless to get them back, makes the United States look weak. All of those things, it's a big problem. Reagan kind of runs on showing that Carter is weak. And we get, he ends up leaving office after. The OPEC oil crisis, or OPEC embargo. This is again, this kind of happens under two presidents, but it's mostly under Jimmy Carter. The OPEC oil crisis that shoots gas prices up. We talked about how we can feel some similar things, right? Because of the war with Russia, or not war with Russia, but the sanctions and everything on Russia, because of the war in Ukraine, the surging gas prices and everything that happened after that. We felt a little taste of something like this, but it was actually way worse during the OPEC crisis. And that is mostly under Jimmy Carter. We still have some effects of it we still have some effects of it after going into Reagan, but mostly under Carter. Civil Rights Act of 1957. Civil Rights Act of 1957, not super impactful. Doesn't do a whole lot, but we actually talked about something earlier that happened in 1957. Sputnik was launched in 1957. So if we have a Civil Rights Act of 1957, those are the same years. We're not going to have two different presidents during the same year. Use information on the test that you get earlier to answer test questions later. If they answer the question that's later in the test, use that to help you out, right? So Civil Rights Act of 1957, that is Eisenhower. Marines in Lebanon, we didn't talk a ton about the Marines in Lebanon. We did mention it briefly in one slide. There are Marines that are sent into Lebanon to kind of help with some peacekeeping. They're killed. It's seen as an act of terrorism. An act of terrorism that happens there. And that is under Ronald Reagan's presidency that we have the Marines in Lebanon that are killed. At 9/11 attacks, that one should be an easy one. We should know who the president was during the 9/11 attacks. President George W. Bush, right? The 9/11 attacks, 2001. September 11th, 2001, that would be George Bush still being president. That launches us into two wars, basically, we end up in as a result of that. First, the Afghanistan war, almost immediately after, because we say that they're helping harbor al-Qaeda members, right? And we declare war on Afghanistan. And then later, ending up declaring war on Iraq because we believe they have weapons of mass destruction or nukes, basically, right? Which we find out They never had, but we end up in both of those wars after that under George W. Bush. Neither of those wars end under Bush, though. The Balkan crisis. Balkan crisis, we talked about this one briefly also. There was that term ethnic cleansing going on in the Balkans. We said that's basically a euphemism for a genocide, right? An ethnic cleansing is essentially a genocide that is taking place. This happens during the 1990s. So that gives us two options on presidents. That could be the president during the 1990s. That's George H.W. Bush or Bill Clinton. And it is actually Bill Clinton that the Balkan crisis takes place under. Progressive president, that's pretty broad, but there is two presidents that you could really give the title of progressive. One of them that literally was part of the Progressive Party. The Progressive Party was Theodore Roosevelt. You could also, using that term progressive, kind of put FDR under progressive presidents. You could put Taft under a progressive president, and technically you could put Woodrow Wilson under a progressive president, right? But the big one that would get identified as a progressive president is going to be Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was a Progressive Party member, right? So, like I said, we're going to go down to some presidential scandals. We have the Teapot Dome scandal, court packing plan, Iran-Contra affair, Watergate scandal, impeachment of Bill Clinton, and then there is one of these that is all of them, right? So obstruction of justice. Obstruction of justice is a crime that you commit when you try to cover up another crime. So you don't technically have to be involved directly in the original crime to be convicted of obstruction of justice. It's just a crime of, like I said, covering up another crime. Well, which is the presidential scandal where we talked about technically this president wasn't directly attached to the original crime, but they did everything that they could to cover that crime up. That one was Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal. Illegal wiretapping. This was the illegal wiretapping of the Democratic National Convention to try to get an advantage in the upcoming election, right? What president's reelection campaign sent in former CIA members to the Watergate Hotel to wiretap the Democratic National Convention Center? That was the Nixon reelection campaign, again, under the Watergate scandal. Watergate Hotel, that's where it gets its name, right? Selling oil reserves. This is the old one we haven't talked about in a very long time. This is Teapot Dome scandal. Teapot Dome is basically a government land that is supposed to be used for, government funds, helping fund taxpayer initiatives, all of that kind of stuff, right? Any money the government makes is supposed to go into programs for the people. However, the government official, Albert Fall, ends up selling these oil reserve lands or leasing them out basically for private companies to make a profit off of it. And he takes a kickback on it, right? He gets some of the profits off of that sale and using these oil reserves. That's Albert Fall, right? You can think of him as the fall guy in the scandal. If you ever heard of the fall guy, normally the guy that takes the blame. Albert Fall takes the fall in the Teapot Dome scandal. Richard Nixon, we've said it enough times, that's Watergate, right? We should know Richard Nixon, Watergate scandal. Adding Supreme Court justices. Well, what's the only one of these that sounds like it would have to do with Supreme Court justices? If you look at those names, one of them has the word court in it, right? The Supreme Court packing plan. You're going to pack the court with as many justices that are on your side as you can. This was FDR's scandal or plan, right? Remember, the Supreme Court kept striking down New Deal legislation as unconstitutional, and FDR was getting real upset with that. He was like, you're getting in my way. I want to be able to pass my New Deal legislation without having to worry that you're going to strike it all down. He comes up with a plan to basically pack the court with a bunch of pro-New Deal Supreme Court justices. Trading guns for hostages. Remember, there's a group of terrorists that take hostages, and this president says on record, we do not negotiate with terrorists, right? He kind of popularizes that phrase. You might have heard it before, right? George W. Bush says that phrase, kind of calling back to when this president said, we do not negotiate with terrorists, but we end up finding out later behind the scenes, he, wanted to do anything he could to get those hostages back. And we trade weapons to Iranian terrorists to get back our hostages, right? The Iran, sorry, not the Iran hostage crisis. This is the Iran-Contra affair, So, sorry, burglary at the Democratic National Headquarters. Well, I've already said it a couple times, right? Whose re-election campaign sent CIA members to go into the Democratic National Headquarters to plant wiretapping devices to get dirt on them and an advantage in the re-election. That is Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal. Perjury / lying under oath. Remember, this president and his impeachment is well known for a different aspect of this scandal, right? Having an affair in the White House. That's the big thing that's well known about it. But technically, that's not what gets him impeached. What gets him impeached is that he lies about it under oath, right? This is Bill Clinton's impeachment because he perjures himself, which means lying under oath is perjury, right? Remember, impeachment and conviction are different things. Impeachment is the House saying, hey, we think the president did a bad thing and we should investigate that thing, right? And so they vote that, this is serious. We did our investigation. The Senate should then vote on whether or not to remove them from office, right? So Bill Clinton was impeached but not removed from office. The Senate does not vote to remove him. Diverting profits to anti-communist rebels. There are these anti-communist rebels fighting in Nicaragua. This is during kind of the later part of the Cold War. We're still actively anti-communist. We want to help these, or at least this president wants to help these anti-communist rebels, but Congress says, no, we're not going to allow you to fund them, partially because they're tied to the cocaine trade, partially because we might have learned some lessons from previous presidents like Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon, that, there are some problems with letting the president just have a bunch of power over military interactions and funding and all of that stuff, right? So the Reagan administration finds that kind of secret way to fund the Contras. This is the Contra part of the Iran-Contra affair. Remember, the CIA gets $30 million to buy weapons to give to Iran for the hostages. They only use $12 million of that funding to buy the weapons. They use the remaining $18 million to fund the Contras in Nicaragua to fight those communists. All right. So then we have Israel was an intermediate. That kind of sounds really confusing to say they're an intermediate. It just means they're like kind of involved in the whole situation. This is the Iran-Contra affair. We were helping defend Israel in a conflict, and that's what leads to the hostages getting taken and the whole thing in Iran and all that. This doesn't come up a ton about the Iran-Contra. More important to know the weapons trade for the hostages and the Contras being funded with the profits or the remaining money from that weapons trade. Executive privilege. The president in this scandal argues that he doesn't have to release information about the scandal because of his, quote, executive privilege. He argues The president has the ability to withhold any information he sees fit due to national security concerns. And that is Richard Nixon claims executive privilege so he doesn't have to release those White House tapes, the recordings that have him, committing obstruction of justice, trying to cover up the Watergate scandal. Getting rid of justices over 70. Again, this should be easy because you see that word justices. What's the only thing that has to do with court justices, specifically Supreme Court justices? That is the court packing plan. Remember, FDR was upset they were striking down his New Deal legislation. He called them old men on the jury, holding him back, right? So the plan was to set an age limit on the Supreme Court of 70 years of age. That would get rid of some justices for him, and he'd be able to put on a bunch of New Deal, pro-New Deal Supreme Court justices. Ronald Reagan said it enough times at this point, you should know that's Iran-Contra affair. He is the president during that. The Ohio Gang. The Ohio Gang is a corrupt group in the cabinet of this president. They are Warren G. Harding's cabinet, so we'll answer 14 and 15 at the same time here. They come with Warren G. Harding into the White House. They're known for kind of rampant corruption. One of the big things with that corruption is the Teapot Dome scandal. That's kind of the big scandal that breaks, that really cements the Ohio Gang as a corrupt group in Warren G. Harding's administration. So there we go. That answers 14 and 15. 16 should again be another easy one because we've said a couple of times the court packing plan was FDR's plan to get more New Deal legislation passed, right? Oliver North, he is a military official tied to the Iran-Contra affair. He is the one that's kind of a whistleblower on the Iran-Contra affair a little bit. He admits that he did participate in the scandal, that he helped get the weapons to the Iranian terrorists, and that he helped fund the Contras in Nicaragua. So that is Oliver North. He does get convicted of a crime on this one. Public lost trust in the president. This should be an easy one. It's all of them, right? All of these scandals cause distrust of the president. And then a lot of these ones are more and more modern scandals, right? All the Iran-Contra affair, Watergate, Bill Clinton, those happen basically in a 20-year period, right? From the 1970s to the 1990s. We have those scandals happen, and that widens and widens and widens the credibility gap, the American public not trusting the government. All right, next one. Matching historical figures with a description of them. Some of these people we didn't talk about in class, or at least my class didn't. I know we didn't, but some of them are easier than others. So this first one, owns a cable network and supported Obama as president in 2008. The one that should make this a little bit easier is owns a cable network. She had a very, very popular TV show, daytime TV show for super long time. I actually don't know how long she was the host of that show. I would say decades, but I don't know off the top of my head how long. Oprah Winfrey was the host of the Oprah Winfrey Show, and she goes on to start the OWN network, Oprah Winfrey Network, OWN. So that is Oprah Winfrey. First lady that led healthcare reforms in 1990s. She was a U.S. Senator and Secretary of State under Obama. This is the only first lady on this list, Hillary Clinton, right? Hillary Clinton was the first lady. She later runs for president, does not get elected, as we know, right? But that is Hillary Clinton on B. Advocated for women's rights, suffrage, and led a movement for prohibition to be passed. We did talk about this a couple of times. Remember, we said that basically the women's rights movement and the prohibition movement were tied very directly to each other at the time. Unfortunately, basically because of domestic abuse was a big reason that they were tied to each other, is because they tied alcoholism to domestic abuse, which there are statistics that show that those two things do get attached to each other quite a bit, right? So those two got tied together. And this was Frances Willard, that was a big advocate for both women's rights and suffrage and the prohibition movement. Founder of BET. Now, this is one we did not talk about in my class, at least. That is Robert Johnson. He comes up every once in a while as that word for people that start a business and become very successful off that business. An entrepreneur. Robert Johnson will come up as an prominent entrepreneur, right? He becomes a multimillionaire off of the BET network, right? Famous spiritual advisor to several presidents, supporter of civil rights. We did talk about this guy as an evangelist. We called him an evangelist, somebody, or a televangelist also, specifically somebody that uses television to help spread their religion, right? This is going to be Billy Graham. Billy Graham also helped as a spiritual advisor, basically like a religious advisor for a few presidents. First woman Supreme Court justice. First woman Supreme Court justice. Firsts come up, right? Firsts come up a pretty decent amount. This one we did talk about. She is placed on the Supreme Court by Ronald Reagan. This is Sandra Day O'Connor. Sandra Day O'Connor is the first female Supreme Court justice. The other first on the Supreme Court justices that'll come up is the first Black Supreme Court justice. That was Thurgood Marshall, the NAACP lawyer that argued Brown versus the Board of Education, and then later actually joined the Supreme Court. We then have challenged ideas that suburban housewives were happy cleaning and cooking dinners, and wrote the book, The Feminine Mystique. This is a feminist that we talked a pretty decent amount about when she was historically relevant in class and everything, going over it. That is Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique and became pretty famous off of it as a feminist figure. Founded the largest Hispanic advertising agency. Again, this is not one that we talked about in class a lot. Another one that would be known as an entrepreneur. This is Leonel Sosa, is going to be the person known as, founder of the Hispanic advertising agency. Politician in the 1960s who sparked a resurgence of the conservative political movement. We very briefly mentioned this guy, so I'll just give it to you. That is Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater is known as a very popular conservative politician during the time. He does run for president and actually loses his presidential campaign, but he's extremely influential over the Nixon campaign and the resurgence of conservative politicians, right? So that is Barry Goldwater. First Hispanic justice and the third woman to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. This, the only one that's left, Sonia Sotomayor. Sonia Sotomayor, like it says, another first Hispanic Supreme Court justice. And then still pretty early in the number of female Supreme Court justices, the third ever. I think we're up to 5 now. 5 female Supreme Court justices total have been appointed to the Supreme Court. But all right, we have Amy Coney Barrett under Trump not last year. Geez, years go by quickly. 2 years ago. And then we have the new Supreme Court justice just added under Biden, whose name I'm blanking on right now. But I'll scroll down. So how did we solve this? We have an issue and we're looking at how that issue was solved. Now, I'll say in advance, solved for some of these sounds a little bit bad. Don't necessarily mean positive solution, but something that we did as a result to try and resolve the issue. But Cuban Missile Crisis, we can look through. These are all fairly short. I guess I'll go with the other side because some of those are longer. Passage of the 21st Amendment. Passage of the 21st Amendment. Now, remember, on the 21st Amendment, we have kind of that trick to remember both 18 and 21. What age are you an adult? 18, but what are you not allowed to do? Drink. When are you allowed to drink? 21. So 18 is prohibition. 21 repeals prohibition. So we're looking for prohibition in here. Well, we have increased crime during prohibition at number 2 there. So the passage of the 21st Amendment is going to go with increased crime during prohibition. It also helps give a little boost to the economy because we pass it. It's passed under FDR as a way to kind of help get us out of the depression because we can start taxing alcohol again. Dropped the atomic bomb. What was the reasoning given for the dropping of the atomic bomb? We talked about that basically it was to end World War II. We wanted to prevent a land invasion of Japan and end the war more quickly, was at least the reasoning given by Harry S. Truman. So we see ending World War II on there. That's going to be dropping the atomic bomb. Passage of the U.S. Patriot Act in 2001. Well, if you don't remember what the Patriot Act is, that year should at the very least be a tip-off. What huge, major world event happened in 2001 that we talked about? Well, that is September 11th, 2001, right? 9/11. So we can just go right here. We see 9/11 concerns about terrorists. That's probably the U.S. Patriot Act. If you do remember what the Patriot Act is, it's the one that gives the government basically kind of a blank check on surveillance powers over American citizens, that they can wiretap you and pull back your phone records and a bunch of surveillance that the government basically was proven to be doing without any warrants because of the Patriot Act. And it was a huge problem, big old scandal when it gets revealed. Quarantine of the island of Cuba. Well, what's the only thing on that list that mentions Cuba? Should be pretty easy. That is the Cuban Missile Crisis. By quarantine, they're kind of referring to the fact that we put a blockade, a naval blockade around Cuba to prevent Soviet submarines from being able to get to Cuba to deliver their payload of nuclear weapons that they wanted to put in those missile silos there. And this doesn't really solve the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? We still are in the thick of the Cuban Missile Crisis with the quarantine of Cuba, but it gets resolved once the United States and the Soviets decide together to remove nuclear weapons from Cuba and Turkey. Revolution and overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani and the annexation as a state. So what's the only one on there that would be a state that was annexed? We mentioned Hawaii. Remember, the business members or businessmen and leaders on Hawaii were getting upset about high tariffs on selling sugar specifically from Hawaii. We get the businessman Stanford B. Dole, who was a lawyer and businessman in Hawaii, who organizes the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii and Queen Liliuokalani, and then promotes the annexation of the state. He becomes the president and then governor of the state. This is all part of American expansionism or imperialism, right? So World War II. Now, this one might sound confusing. How is World War II a solution to something? But remember, we said World War II and the basically turning the entire United States economy into a wartime economy that the government had full control over, could ramp production way up, employ millions and millions of people as either soldiers or as wartime production members, did give our economy the kick it needed to get us out of the Great Depression. Okay, so World War II kind of does solve the Great Depression. So Community Reinvestment Act of 1977. Again, this is one we didn't talk a ton about, but it was in the review earlier. I think it was on day 2 of the review. We talked about the Community Reinvestment Act under Jimmy Carter. If you're talking about community reinvestment and you hear housing on there, those two kind of go together. This was to help with discrimination in housing. We had that practice that we talked about called redlining, where banks would put red lines around areas they wouldn't give home loans to, or give home loans to people from those areas, right? That led to kind of really, really bad conditions in those areas over a long period of time. And the Community Reinvestment Act was trying to help solve that problem. So this is the one I was talking about. Sounds really bad with solved a problem. Placed Native Americans on reservations, right? This isn't necessarily solving a problem, but this is what we did in response to people wanting to settle the Western Front. Again, quote unquote, settle that area. If people are already there, it's not necessarily settling as much as it is conquering that area, right? So that is going to be settling the Western Front, is placing Native Americans on reservations. Supported rebels of Colombia in overthrowing their government. Well, we actually already mentioned this. What event causes the United States government to support a revolution in Panama? The building of the Panama Canal. We want that canal zone. Colombia doesn't want to give it to us. So we convince Panama to have a revolution, and the hook on that revolution, supporting them in it, is basically we get that canal zone, right? We give the canal zone back under President Jimmy Carter, right? We give everything but the canal itself back in the 1970s, and then the canal is given back in 2000. Civil Rights Act of 1964, this outlaws segregation in public areas, like we said, basically, right? And that is what put those segregation laws in place and kept them in place. That was Jim Crow laws. Hired women to work in factories. When do we get women and people of color also get a lot more opportunities in industrial jobs and factories? Well, that is during World War I and World War II, because all of the men are off fighting it. We have World War I and World War I on there. Let's fix that. But World War I and World War II, we see increased numbers of women in the workforce. Almost done. Almost halfway through, right? Over halfway, I'd say. This is a full page. That one's a little under a page. This one's a little shorter than the other ones. All right. What were these people against? This section should go pretty quickly, honestly. So Huey Long, that one's a tougher one, just because it's been a long time since we talked about him, and he wasn't really a major figure. Huey Long was the guy that was known for the Share Our Wealth program, or his policy of share our wealth. I'm gonna take a sip of coffee 1 second. Huey Long was known for the Share Our Wealth plan, and he was a opponent of the New Deal, and different from most of the opponents of the New Deal. Most opponents of the New Deal thought that it was too radically left-wing and gave the government too much control and all this stuff. Huey Long was actually an opponent of the New Deal from the left wing. He actually wanted it to go further and do some more wealth redistribution. George Wallace, this is one of our Southern governors during the 1950s and 60s. So take a guess what a Southern Democrat governor was against in the 1960s. That would be integration, right? Remember, integration is the opposite of segregation. Segregating, keeping people separate; integrating, mixing people together. Republican Party, the Republican Party was basically against the New Deal, right? The Republican Party is against the New Deal. FDR is a Democrat, right? Again, Republicans throughout history are typically economically conservative, laissez-faire economic policies, right? So the Republican Party is going to be against the New Deal initiative. The hippie movement, the countercultural movement with the hippies and all of that, right? What are the hippies on this list going to be against? The Vietnam War, right? The hippies are definitely very, very against the Vietnam War. Governor Orville Faubus, another Southern governor. That Southern governor is going to be against integration. Orville Faubus was the governor in the Little Rock Nine crisis, closed down the school after Eisenhower sent in the military to force him to integrate it and everything, right? Congressional bloc of Southern Democrats, said it like 4 times now, right? That's going to be against integration again, right? 1960s Southern Democrats are going to be very against integration. Oh, I accidentally gave this one away because I didn't realize it was on here. I called the hippies part of the counterculture movement and said hippies were against the Vietnam War. Guess what the counterculture movement is against in general? The Vietnam War, right? Remember, we talked about the power dynamics that the group power dynamics that the counterculture movement is against. We listened to Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater. I ain't no senator's son, no millionaire's son, no military son. Don't like that these people set up the system in a way to keep power for themselves and their descendants, right? We want to go against those power structures and go against things like the Vietnam War. Lester Maddox, again, a Southern governor during the 1960s. He was the one that was known for threatening that group with the axe handle and then took that axe handle around with him as kind of a prop during his election campaign, right? That's Lester Maddox against integration. Big businesses were against the New Deal because they didn't like all of those new regulations that were being placed on them and taxes and all of that. So the big business was definitely very, very against the New Deal. Francis Townsend, haven't talked about him in a long while. Either he was a priest, which might make you think, oh, this sounds like a cool guy, maybe like a nice guy in some ways. No, he was not. He was a fascist, right? Like, not saying that hyperbolically, like some people like just accuse people they don't like of being fascist. Like, he supported the Nazi party and was an outright fascist that was a opponent of the New Deal during the 1930s, right? Supreme Court, again, talked about this a couple times. They were against a lot of New Deal policies, saying they were government overreaches and that they were unconstitutional. So they're going to be opponents of the New Deal. Said that section would go fast. Not too much left. All right, vocabulary terms, some matching here. So let's remind ourselves some of these vocab terms that we should know. So, person who believes that there should be no government. This is a little bit of a simplification of this. Technically, these people believe that don't believe in what they call arbitrary power structures or unjustified power structures. This is going to be anarchists who are typically against organized governments, right? But that is anarchists. A pseudoscience that deals with the improvement of hereditary qualities of race or breed. We talked about this as a pseudoscience means like a fake science. This was the fake science that Nazis believed in, that some, the KKK of the 1920s that got very popular in the United States believed in, that some government officials believed in, that we actually have states in the United States that pass these kind of laws, eugenics laws, right? We have some states in the United States that pass laws that allow them to chemically castrate, meaning sterilize or make it where these people can't have children. They pass laws that sterilize or let you legally sterilize people with mental disabilities, right? So those are eugenics laws, that fake science. A city or a town. What kind of area is a city or a town in? That is in an urban area, right? Urbanization is the creation of more and more cities, right? Policy of favoring native-born Americans over those of immigrants. or immigration, right? They don't want immigration into the United States. They want to prevent immigration into the United States and all of that, right? Those are the nativists. They only like native-born Americans, as they put it, right? However, when you say native-born Americans, a lot of people would think of, Native Americans, maybe. So it'd be interesting to see the response of nativists when you tell them that Native Americans should be the one treated as real Americans over themselves. They would not like that very much, but anyways, an active effort to improve employment or education opportunities for minorities. This executive order signed into office by LBJ is affirmative action, requires any business or school with federal funding to make an active effort to improve employment opportunities or education opportunities for minorities. Called Christians to rise and challenge them to basically help out their fellow man. Well, what's the only one on there that sounds like it has a religious term in there? That is going to be the social gospel movement. Geographic area that is located outside of cities and towns. This is, farmland and small towns and areas. That would be rural, the opposite of urban. Rural areas. To absorb a group into a culture or larger population. This can sometimes be called Americanization in the United States, since America is the larger group or population, or another general term for it would be assimilation or to assimilate. Did I skip one? I think I skipped one because I know that I should have answered one of these already. Where is it? Someone committed to the expansion of liberty generally prefers social programs for the disadvantaged. That's the one that I skipped on accident. That one is liberal. Different human races competed for survival just as different plants and animals did in the natural world. I don't like the definition that they put on this because it's not correct. Now that's referring to Darwinism in a form, but it's not referring to social Darwinism directly. Social Darwinism basically argues that there shouldn't be intervention with like social programs and things like that, because those that succeed rise to the top through survival of the fittest, and that actually you would be hampering the process of Darwinism or natural selection to have things like social programs. That's the argument of social Darwinism, but that's is social Darwinism. And then someone who seeks to preserve traditional customs and values generally prefers less government regulation and spending, lower taxes, things like that. That is going to be conservative, is K. So through that one, almost done, 2 sections left. Like I said, this one should be a faster one. This is going to be, the last 2 sections are the longest sections, but I'll go through them very quickly, like I have been on these ones. So NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, we're trying to figure out, is this a domestic or foreign policy? Is it something that deals with things inside the United States or deals with things outside of the United States? So if it is the North American Free Trade Agreement, we're making an agreement with people, above us in Canada or below us in Mexico, right? This is definitely dealing with other countries. That would be a foreign policy. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gives full military powers to the president to intervene in the Vietnam War. Well, Vietnam's definitely not inside the United States. So again, that is going to be a foreign policy. Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, with Chinese being in the name, you might think automatically, oh, that's probably going to be a foreign policy because it's dealing with China. However, it's excluding Chinese immigrants from the country. We're keeping people from being able to immigrate into the country. That is a domestic policy because it has to do with who we are and are not allowing to immigrate into the country. Balkans crisis. The Balkans crisis was that ethnic cleansing or genocide that was going on in the Balkans that we sent troops in to prevent, right? So that is going to be foreign policy. Reaganomics, this is an economic policy that we have control over inside the United States. That's going to be domestic policy. Camp David Accords, we already talked a little bit about. Jimmy Carter is known for this one. The Camp David Accords is a peace agreement or a peace treaty signed between Israel and Egypt, right? So that's definitely going to be foreign policy, dealing with two other countries. Interstate Commerce Act. Well, interstate, that is clearly inside the United States, dealing between states. That's going to be a domestic policy. Contract with America. Now, you might think this is another country signing a contract with us, so that'd be foreign policy. But this is a politician that comes out with what he says is going to be his contract with the American people. This is what he's going to offer the American people and everything. That is a domestic policy. The Strategic Defense Initiative, aka Star Wars program that happens under Ronald Reagan. This is a policy of how we're going to kind of deal with the threat of nuclear missiles. Nuclear missiles definitely aren't going to come from inside the country. That is a foreign policy. It's a military foreign policy. So now we're figuring out the description. Which one of these policies goes with this description here? So we have U.S. forces sent as part of a NATO coalition to halt ethnic cleansing. Well, I already talked about which one of these had to do with ethnic cleansing. That is the Balkans crisis. The Balkans crisis has to do with ethnic cleansing. So that is D, going next to number one there. Law that prohibited unfair practices by railroads. This is the first U.S. federal law regulating interstate trade. This is the Interstate Commerce Act. Remember, the railroads kind of had these unfair practices that they were putting in place just to gouge people on prices. Congress said that's not fair. We are going to kind of make it where you can't do that anymore. That is the Interstate Commerce Act. Reverse the trend of large government. This is supply side economics to end stagflation, and it had tax cuts attached to it. Remember, we said supply side economics, trickle down economics, and Reaganomics all mean the same thing, basically, right? Tax cuts, reducing government programs, all of those kinds of things. All right, moving on. Congress gave Johnson full military power to stop communism. Again, this is something that we've mentioned a couple of times throughout this portion of this review. You should know this is the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, on that one. Anti-ballistic defense system to prevent nuclear attack. Well, I already said one of these was specifically to help prevent nuclear attack. That is the Star Wars system or Strategic Defense Initiative. Remember, there's supposed to be like a laser satellite system that shoots down nuclear missiles from anywhere in the world and all that, right? Not something we were capable of doing in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, but kind of part of that peace through strength, building up the military, flexing our muscles to other countries to make them afraid of us. That is kind of what the Star Wars program goes under. Banned immigration of Chinese people to the United States. Take a guess which one that is. Republican proposed series of reforms, tax cuts, welfare reform, and requirement that laws apply to American public also apply to Congress. Now, this one you might have thought sounded like Reaganomics because we threw tax cuts in there and welfare reform in there, but this is a politician that was inspired by Ronald Reagan and definitely takes a lot of cues from him, Newt Gingrich, who came out with the contract with America during the 1990s under the Clinton presidency. Treaty that gradually phased out tariffs. Well, which one of these talked about free trade? Tariffs are a tax on trade between different states. We have the North American Free Trade Agreement that's guaranteeing free trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. That's probably the one that phased out tariffs. Agreement between Israel and Egypt that led to a peace treaty. Again, kind of already gave the answer on this when I described the Camp David Accords as a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. Now let's put these in the correct decade. NATO is in the 1990s under Bill Clinton. Law that prohibited unfair. Off the top of my head, I don't remember the exact decade on the Interstate Commerce Act. I'm going to guess, and then I'll look at the key. I'm going to guess this was 1880s. 1880s, I think, is the exact decade for that one. Well, that's wrong. On the key, it says 1960s. I'm assuming somebody put that in wrong. I'm going to go with it was 1860s because it absolutely was not. The Interstate Commerce Act wasn't dealing with unfair railroad practices in the 1960s. So somebody had a typo on there, but whatever. I'm going to go with, oh, nope, I see what they did. They switched these two. No, that doesn't make any sense because then the key goes on to say that Reaganomics was in 1880s. So the key's wrong. I'll look it up for you guys. Interstate commerce. Ooh, 1880s. Look at that. I was right. 1880s, 1887. Okay. So then going down one, we do have Reaganomics. That's 1980s under Ronald Reagan. 1980s under Ronald Reagan. Congress gave Johnson full military powers to stop communism. That is late 1960s. It's 1968. Is that Johnson gets the full military, or not 1968? It's 1963. It's early 1960s. Is Johnson gets the full military powers? Sorry. Movie. No. Now it's bothering me. It's 1960s, but I want the exact year. Where's the year? Just give me the year. 64. Okay, 64. So neither of the one I said, but close to 63. Whatever. Anti-ballistic defense system to prevent nuclear attack. It's under Reagan. It's the 1980s. Banned immigration of Chinese to the United States. I'm going to go again with, I think that was 1880s. It might be 1870s. Let's look for the exact year. '80s again, right? Okay. Republican, this is 1990s, is the Contracts with America. NAFTA is 1990s as well. And then the Camp David Accords is 1970s under Carter. So last section here. So we have, again, another one of those matching sections. This one, nice. They're being a little nicer. It is quite a bit shorter with 37 or 27 terms total instead of 45 terms total. So this should go quite a bit faster. Let me grab my piece of paper so I make sure that I'm actually attributing something to each of these as I go through. So I'm going to write down 1 through 9. 1, 2. All right. So let's go through. Muckrakers. Muckrakers are a big part of the progressive era. Remember, they are the they're basically, sorry, I'm adjusting stuff. They're basically the reporters that kind of dig through the dirt and the muck to expose the bad things that are going on in society. So let's look at a couple of things on here. Settlement houses does seem like kind of a valid answer on there. They could, oh no, settlement houses. I'm thinking of tenement houses. Settlement houses aren't going to be addressed by that. Title 9, way too late for them. Mexican Repatriation Act, that's also too late for them. Ida B. Wells is a good one. Ida B. Wells is a good option. Let's keep looking. Labor unions wouldn't be covered by them. Berlin Airlift, way too late. American Expeditionary Force, too late. Great Migration, not a bad thing. Rust Belt, way too late. So that's going to be Ida B. Wells. We did talk about her. She is essentially a muckraker, right? Ida B. Wells is a muckraker. And the thing that she's concerned with is the lynching epidemic that is taking place when she is alive, and she kind of does this big study on the lynchings that are going on throughout the United States and kind of shows how bad the problem really is and kind of the cause of these lynchings, because there's kind of a myth that lynchings happen. The myth of lynchings is that they happen because of sexual assaults of Black men against white women. And she basically definitively proves that that's not the case. Not saying that there's never been cases of, that happening, but that's not why lynchings happen, and that there's not some increased rate or big number of assaults happening between Black men and white women. That lynchings are typically racially motivated if there is a Black person that's in a position of power in some way, is typically when lynchings will happen. So U.S. troops during World War I. This one's an easy one. The U.S. troops during World War I were known as the American Expeditionary Force. So number 2 is going to go to number 7. During the Great Depression. So this happened during the Great Depression. Well, there's only one of these things on this list that happened during the Great Depression. That is the Mexican Repatriation Act. So number 3 is going to go with number 3. Remember, Mexican repatriation, this means sending people that immigrated from Mexico to Mexico during the Great Depression. This is basically because the unemployment rate is so high that the United States government's kind of doing anything they can to decrease the population of people competing for those jobs. One of the huge problems with this, though, is also that a lot of the people that are quote unquote repatriated are American citizens. They're just of Hispanic descent living in predominantly Hispanic populations. Going down to the next one, movement of African Americans. This is the Great Migration, right? The big movement of African Americans from the South to the North for industrial jobs that happens, right? So that is the Great Migration. That is number 4 going with number 8. We then have North and Midwest area. This is the Rust Belt. We didn't talk about this a ton in my class. It was on your George H.W. Bush map that this came up, that you would have talked a little bit about this, but the Rust Belt is the Northeast and Midwest. So number 5 going with number 9. Divided Germany. This is part of the Berlin airlift. Germany is divided, and it kind of causes the Berlin airlift to happen, right? Stalin gets really mad that the other allies joined their portions of Germany without letting him know that that was going to happen, or like consulting him on it, basically. And he thinks that they're conspiring against him. He closes down access to Berlin, and it's the first major event of the Cold War. So that one is 6 is going with 6. Got 2 of those this time on the matching. Women's rights in sports. This is Title IX. We've talked about this a couple of times in the review. Title IX requires equal funding of men's and women's programs in education. One of those, the major programs they require equal funding in is sports programs. Knights of Labor. Anyone can join. The Knights of Labor is a big labor union, right? That kind of just makes sense with labor being in the name. So then we should, number 9 should match up with number 1, and it does. Jane Addams founds the settlement house Settlement houses are kind of a place that immigrants can go to when they first come to the United States to help them assimilate into American culture, as we used that term assimilate earlier. Fought as a unit. So that one might be a little confusing. Fought as a unit. So best answer for that with fought as a unit, I would go with the American Expeditionary Force. It's a little bit vague, right? But that is a military force. That seems like the best answer to me. I haven't looked at the key, so I don't know. Let's look at it. Okay, some of these are vague, right? That is correct though. So American Expeditionary Force 10, so 7, 10. Fed and supplied the city. So this one's kind of obvious. The whole reason this thing happened is because Berlin got closed off through the blockade from Stalin. So the Berlin airlift helped feed and supply the city. Berlin airlift is number 6, gets number 11. And then we have leading social reform. So that could be Settlement House. That could be Ida B. Wells. That kind of could be labor unions. So let's look at some of the other ones and see if they match a little bit better. So linked to federal funding, that's going to be Title IX. None of the rest of these really make any sense with linked to federal funding. If you don't follow Title IX rules, you don't get money from the government as a school, okay? So 12 is going to go with number 2. Reduced unemployment, reduced the level of unemployment. So it kind of reduced the unemployment rate. Again, remember we talked about the Mexican repatriation. They were getting rid of the number of people competing for jobs to kind of make it easier for people to get it. That was the whole goal of it. So Mexican repatriation, number 3 is going to get number 14. Still haven't eliminated Ida B. Wells or settlement houses or labor unions. So let's keep going to see. Oh, here we go. So helped immigrants. That's definitely going to be settlement houses, right? The whole purpose of them. So that eliminates one of our possible answers, right? So number 15 is going to go with number 1, 15 right there. Went to find jobs in the North. We talked about this. The Great Migration is part of African Americans moving from the South to the North for industrial jobs. So 16 is going to go with, where's Great Migration? Number 8, 16. People left for the Sun Belt. So belt, I would just attach those two. But basically the Rust Belt is where a lot of old industrial jobs were. And when those started to dry up because of basically outsourcing jobs, sending factories either to Mexico or to China. So it's called the Rust Belt because it was like an industrial area that was really big during the early 1900s. By like the 1980s, 1990s, a lot of those jobs are drying up. So people move into what's called the Sun Belt. And because it's an industrial area where you're dealing with metal all the time, and now it's getting old and people don't like it as much, they call it the Rust Belt because it's rusted and not as good anymore. And then safer working conditions. Safing working conditions definitely makes more sense for labor unions than it does Ida B. Wells. So we'll put 18 with labor unions because they would, go on strike or work to get better, safer working conditions in general. So that does answer us that leading social reform was Ida B. Wells on there. So we can then go back and put leading social reforms, put 12 there with number 4. Okay. All right. So then we're going to located in slum neighborhoods. So located in slum neighborhoods, this is settlement houses because that's where kind of most of the immigrants were, right? They lived in tenement housing in slums, right? So number 19 is going to go with settlement houses. Jane Addams settlement houses. U.S. did not back down. The United States did not back down. That goes best with the Berlin airlift, right? Stalin kind of gives us this ultimatum, makes it look like we might have to stop a war or just give up Berlin, but the United States doesn't back down. We airlift all those supplies in as needed to get through it. So Berlin airlift is number what? Which one's Berlin airlift? Number 6. So 20 goes with number 6. Decreased population in the 1970s and 80s. So this is going to be, again, the Rust Belt. People start leaving that area when there's less jobs in the Rust Belt, going over to the Sun Belt, as it said. So that one is going to be 21, goes with 9. Cause anti-lynching. So it not caused anti-lynching, but their cause was anti-lynching. Who wrote about the lynching epidemic and why it was such a problem and all of these things? Ida B. Wells did. So that's going to be 22, number 4. Promise of life without deep racism. Promise of life without deep racism. That's going to be moving from, the rural South up to the North, where things might be a little bit better. That is the Great Migration. Great Migration is, where is it? Sorry. Great Migration, number 8. Number 8 gets number 23. All right. And then saw increase of women in college. That, again, the one that we've talked about, being part of women in college and equal funding and equal rights and all of those things, that is going to be Title IX. So number 2 gets 24. Led by John J. Pershing, General John J. Pershing. That is the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. He's the head of the American Expeditionary Force in World War I, 25. AFL, only skilled workers, American Federation of Labor. This one, again, goes with labor unions. We're talking about a labor union, right? So American Federation of Labor, that goes with number 5, number 26. Number 25, that leaves us only one left. Return to Mexico. That does match up with the Repatriation Act, so we're all good there. So the Mexican Repatriation Act gets number 27. There we go. Done. Finished, as it is in ASL. So that's the last one. Hope somebody uses them in some way at all. But all right, bye guys. Good luck with the STAAR.